Good evening, everyone. I'm Morgan Boyle. I'm the manager of adult programming here at the New York Public Library. I'm thrilled to welcome everyone to the Stavros Niarchos Foundation Library and to this beautiful space overlooking Fifth Avenue. While you're here, get a library card. Check out a few books or learn more about all the programs that we have. There's stuff going on in this space all the time and also throughout all of the branches of the library. If you're watching virtually, hello as well. Sorry you can't be here today. We'd love to see you soon, so drop by anytime. So beyond this program, we have a lot of other things going on right now. We have programs and classes for all ages. We have a new exhibition across the street, A Century of the New Yorker, and of course, everything is free. If you'd like to learn more, you can go to our website, nypl.org, sign up for our newsletter, and then you'll kind of know all of the stuff we're doing. So we're going to get started. Tonight we're welcoming Liz Pelly, author of Mood Machine, The Rise of Spotify and the Cost of the Perfect Playlist. Drawing on over 100 interviews with industry insiders, former Spotify employees, and musicians, Mood Machine takes us to the inner workings of today's highly consolidated record business, showing what has changed as music has become increasingly playlisted, personalized, and auto-played. Tonight, Liz will be speaking with legendary New York City radio host John Schaefer, who has spent the past 40 years championing genre-spanning artists from around the world. After the discussion, we're going to have time for a Q&A, so be thinking of questions. And now, without further ado, we're happy to welcome Liz Pelly and John Schaefer. We hope you enjoy the program.
Liz, I'm looking forward to sort of diving into some of the nuts and bolts of the book. But before we do that, I want to pull back and ask a big picture question. It is clear from reading the book that this must have been an exhaustive and perhaps exhausting process that took a very long time and a lot of research. What was it that first put Spotify into your crosshairs and made you think, I have to write about this?
That is a very good question. So the year would have been around 2016, and there were a few different things that were going on at the time. I think, it was a moment where personally as a music journalist, I think I was starting to get a little bit maybe bored with the things that you can do as a music journalist. You know, you write an album review, you interview a band, you write a show preview, blurb 30 best bands of 2013. And I think part of me was thinking, like, what else can I do with this? So I made a list of stories, of topics that I could write about that would be more investigative. One story that I wrote that was at the top of the list was investigating a NYPD multi-agency task force that had been shutting down venues around New York City. And I did write that. I FOIA'd the NYPD to write about the March program. And then the second story on the list was Spotify playlists, which there were a bunch of different reasons why Spotify playlists ended up on my list. One reason is that I think, this was 2016, the mid-2010s. The year before, I had read this book called The People's Platform by Asher Taylor. That's this sort of book taking a big picture look at the ways in which, the internet didn't end up being the democratizing people's platform that we're all promised, and kind of, debunking this idea that the internet had democratized culture. And I think that after reading that book, I was left thinking, there are a lot of ways to apply the lessons of this book to the current state of the hyper-consolidated recorded music business. At the time, there had been a lot of writing about the ways in which streaming was impacting musicians and the royalty model and how artists weren't being paid fairly. But there wasn't as much writing happening about the experience of listeners. And I think also as someone who is just always been super interested in media criticism and media literacy, I wasn't even really a super big Spotify user myself. I had an account basically since they launched in the United States, but I was looking at the interface and thinking like, what's the deal with these playlists that are on the front page? Like, this must be having a big impact on how people are learning about music, but there must be like something going on with major labels controlling this or something. And I happened to have a friend who worked at a major record label at the time, who I brought it up with, and she said, yeah, you've got to investigate this. Like, so the first article that I wrote was investigating the influence of major labels on Spotify playlists. And, it was just started out as one blog post. But while doing that piece, I interviewed a bunch of marketing, anonymous employees working in digital marketing for major record labels, and I interviewed some musicians. And by the time I finished writing that article, I had a whole long list of other articles that I wanted to write as follow-ups, and it's kind of just been an ongoing process since then.
Mm-hmm. And so with each additional kind of revelation of how Spotify's model truly worked, I mean, you mentioned the teens, and what we were told in the 20-teens was that streaming was the savior of the music industry because at least musicians were getting paid, whereas in the Napster era, it was all just being stolen. Mm-hmm. Shades of, I mean, I remember, LP sleeves in the 1980s that said, home taping is killing music. Mm-hmm. And of course it wasn't, because I might tape a record off the radio, but then when I had the money, I would go and buy the record because I wanted the record. Mm-hmm. But so we were being told that Spotify and streaming in general was good for the music industry. And I suppose if you take music industry to mean big record companies, that may have been true.
Yeah, I think, great point. I think something that I learned pretty quickly during the process of researching the streaming economy is that saving the music business isn't the same thing as saving musicians. So there has been, an incredible amount of wealth generated through streaming services for Sony, Universal, and Warner, but in the early days of reporting on this, it didn't take long to realize through conversations with people working at independent record labels and independent musicians that it certainly wasn't the case that they were the ones seeing any much of this revenue. And there's really been no shortage of anecdotes in the streaming era of independent musicians talking about how hard this new economic model is. I think something that is really interesting, when I first got interested in writing about this subject, like you mentioned, it was a time period where independent musicians were really being sold on this narrative that streaming was going to democratize culture, that, streaming playlists were going to level the playing field, and that the gatekeeper power of major record labels and commercial radio stations was going to be diminished. But something that I think took more time for people in the independent music world to really put together is just the incredible negotiating power that the major labels not only had at the beginning when these streaming services first licensed their deals with the majors, but also all of the different ways in which those early contracts sort of gave major labels influence over the streaming model more broadly. And we continue to sort of see that playing out through to 2025 each time Universal Music Group signs a new deal with Spotify, and all sorts of new types of policies get put into place that have impacts on all independent musicians.
Right. There is another kind of big picture question that I was going to save for later, but since you've already referred to some of the things in it, a kind of a top-heavy model and the musicians getting paid a pittance for their work. I think of back in the days of, commercial radio, LPs. My show was syndicated across the country on NPR, and I would have musicians call me up and say, hey, I heard you you must have played my show because I got a check for 17 cents. I'm not kidding. I would get that all the time. So my big picture question here is, how much of what's happening with Spotify is genuinely new, and how much of it is just a kind of modern age reconfiguration of problems that have kind of been systemically baked into the industry for a very long time?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I try to raise this point early on in the book that in some ways, what we talk about when we talk about various different criticisms that we have of streaming services and the streaming era, in some ways there are some things that are new, but in other ways, there are a lot of criticisms that people have been making of the commercial music industry for a really long time. I write that the streaming era is as much about what's changed as it is about what's stayed the same. Certainly, a lot of the problems that you are discussing when you're discussing streaming services are just problems of the consolidated corporate music business writ large. And I mean, something that I think is new is that streaming services, in some ways, something people will ask a lot, like, well, isn't this just like radio? Isn't this just like a replacement for radio? And commercial radio, maybe. I mean, I would say, clearly there are absolutely so many differences between the role of community and non-commercial radio, and these similarities that maybe do exist with reasons why someone might turn to streaming services versus why someone might turn to commercial radio. But streaming hasn't just been positioned as an alternative to commercial radio. It's also been positioned as an alternative to the record store, as the replacement for the marketplace where artists are going to be compensated for their recordings. So I think that's a major difference. And then another really significant difference also is just the sheer level of data collection that happens with streaming services. As a user of streaming services, you should be under the assumption that every single move you make on these platforms is being collected, and there's all different types of ramifications that has on listening, on the type of music that is deemed as being valuable in these systems, on the type of music that's made, on musicians, the kind of datafication of music in new ways is also really impactful.
One of the single line that haunts me the most from your book is from Daniel Lopatin, who records as One-O-Trix Point Never. Producer, has done a lot of film scores, really interesting composer. And to your point that you just made about this datafication of music, determining what kind of music is valued and therefore what kind of music people are being prompted to make, his question was, what is the music you're not making? What is the music that you would have made left to your own creative devices without the pressures of this thing on you? And that is, you can't answer that question, but just the asking of it sent a shiver down my spine.
Yeah, absolutely. That point is one that really stuck with me too, and it's also one that kind of got me thinking about I think not just about the type of music that's not being made, but also the types of connections with music that aren't being made, because the ways in which we've contextualized music and the way in which we think about the value of music has been totally, in some ways reshaped, or at least there's an idea about the value of music and the context around it that has been put forth by streaming services or the, data-driven platform economy that is much different than, I think the ways in which music might be contextualized by music journalists, community radio DJs and hosts, musicians and listeners themselves.
Or virtually any community of humans at any time before the advent of big record companies.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you were talking before about how streaming services have been positioned as, an alternative to records, alternative to radio stations. there is also the potentially dangerous positioning of these playlists as an alternative to genuine music therapy for people who need to have some kind of, and music therapy, there are people who have PhDs in this. Dr. Connie Tomeno, the pioneer of this, worked with Dr. Oliver Sacks for many, many years, and she will be the first to tell you that there is no playlist that is going to work for more than one person. It has to, for it to work, it has to be targeted. You can't hit a button that worked for someone else and expect it to work for you.
Yeah. Yeah, that was a really, really interesting sort of point to realize during the process of kind of picking apart just the sort of landscape of mood playlists and thinking about like the way in which the mood playlist has sort of emerged as this kind of phenomenon of the streaming era. Like in my book, I have this chapter called The Conquest of Chill, which is sort of just an attempt to take the concept of the chill vibes playlist as a streaming era phenomenon and sort of put it into some context, not just the context of mood music, but the context of media companies and technology companies using the promise of mood stabilization as a way to sell new types of technology, new ways of delivering music to people. And it was super interesting kind of digging into that history and really, realizing how much pseudoscience has informed that whole trajectory and the sort of parallels that exist in many corners of the kind of like mood music cottage industry today.
And here is where I will finally ask you to explain where the title of your book comes from.
Yeah. It's really interesting. Like when I was thinking about the structure of the book initially, the very first book proposal that I wrote was for two different books, actually. And one was going to be about the impact of streaming on listening, and one was going to be about the impact of streaming on artists. I very quickly realized it would make more sense to have them together as one book, but I was really thinking of it in these kind of two halves. The title Mood Machine comes from an article that I wrote in 2019 for The Baffler called Big Mood Machine, which was my investigation into the ways in which Spotify has, not just monitored and extracted mood data, but I was looking into the different ways in which it had packaged and sold mood data to different marketing firms over the years and kind of the broader impact of mood data being treated as this kind of commodity. But in structuring the book, I was thinking about mood being this word that sort of represents the way in which the streaming era has pushed this idea of curation by mood instead of by album or artist, and the impacts of music sort of being transformed in this new type of media product, like the mood playlist. And then thinking about machine, I was thinking about just the various ways in which musicians have been squeezed in this system and kind of the material impact on music. Thinking about those two things sort of together.
But Thomas Edison got there before you. by a good century or more, right? I mean, there was his 1921 article, or I guess it was an article. It was some sort of treatise on how recorded music could shape your mood.
Absolutely. I mean, it was super interesting. When I first started researching this subject, I obviously knew about the history of music as kind of like a prehistory that might like offer some context on the idea of the sort of mood playlist, like musicification of music. But while researching it, I learned that, there's an even deeper history. In the early days of recorded music being like commercially available to consumers, the Thomas Edison and Company in the early 1900s, when it was selling its signature type of vinyl record, a diamond disc, to people to play in their houses for the first time, they had this catalog that they would create called Mood Music, and it was all of the music available from the Edison Corporation at that time, sorted according to musical moods. And they actually had these charts. They were called mood change charts that they would distribute to people, and they would say, like, listen to our diamond disc and chart how your mood changes, like, before you listen to the record and after you listen to the record. And then they would encourage people to host these mood change parties where people would get together and they distribute the mood change charts. And, you'd fill out these forms basically saying, yes, my mood improved when I listened to music. And that's kind of like, the aspect of all of this that is, on one hand, like, kind of obvious, funny, complicated, is that, like, yes, most people's moods improve when they listen to music. Like, that's true. But looking at, like, the Edison catalog is so funny. There's this, like, one image of this, like, businessman in his chair, and it's like he's, having a bad day because stocks are down. And it's like his spirits are lifted by music, like on the second page. I'm like, okay. It's looking through the list of all of the moods that music is organized by in this Edison catalog is super interesting, because the first time I saw it, I was like, those are basically the same categories that music is sorted by on Spotify today.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. And I guess perhaps another example of, tech industry men claiming to have reinvented things that already have existed.
Right. Reinventing the wheel.
Yeah.
A wheel that goes all the way back to Pythagoras, who had, very strong opinions about certain scales that were ennobling, and other scales which inflamed the base emotions. And, I mean, in Baroque Germany, there was a theorist named Johann Mattheson who published he called it Die Affektenlehre, the document of affects, where every scale, he told you what the emotion associated with it was, and when it was appropriate to use it, and when it was not appropriate to use it. I mean, the whole idea of music and mood being intertwined is, I mean, it's ancient.
Yeah.
And you use the word pseudoscience. It's a pseudoscience that we can't kill.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's super interesting. And, to, go back to the original point that you made, like, something that was super interesting was, looking at the ways in which there's so much history for this idea of, like, the music industry and tech companies sort of prescribing this idea of, like, certain music helping people calm down, or there's a certain idea of, like, a type of music that's good for sleeping. And one of, the most interesting interviews that I did for my book was with, my friend who's a music therapist, who pointed out that in the field of music therapy, it's accepted that someone might feel calm when they listen to hardcore punk, or they might feel calm when they listen to nu metal. And you're never going to see a chill playlist on a streaming service with nu metal on it.
Right.
It's a very specific idea of what is meant to be achieved through these specific categories.
And a lot of the music that you will hear on a chill or vibe, one of these playlists, to people like me, it's sonic itchy powder. It's just like, I can't sleep to this. This is driving me up a wall.
Yeah, totally.
And one of the things that, since I don't use Spotify that way for playlists, one of the things that I had been unaware of was the extent to which you use the term fake artists carefully.
Yeah.
But the way these playlists are populated is a symptom of an even bigger problem with the Spotify model. Maybe unpack that for us, if you would.
Yeah, absolutely. So, it's super interesting, actually. The chapter in my book is chapter 5. It's called Ghost Artists for Hire. And the book, I refer to it as a work of reported criticism. So, there's certain chapters that are more investigative and certain chapters that are more cultural criticism, but they're sort of two in my mind, like core investigations that kind of like anchor this book. And one of them is, my investigation into this subject that sort of took over my life for a year, which is trying to get to the bottom of what's going on with, what was going on with these so-called fake artists. So for years, the music business trade press had been speculating about Spotify filling its most popular mood and activity playlists with tracks by artists who didn't exist. And the music business press referred to them as fake artists. You would see people talking about this on social media a lot. My sleep playlist, I noticed that all the tracks on this playlist are by artists whose album art is made with generative AI, and I'm trying to research these artists and I can't find any information about them anywhere online, and they don't have any bios. Like, I think these artists might not be real, this kind of thing. And then in 2022, in the Swedish business press, in the Swedish daily newspaper DN, their tech journalists did a big investigation into this. I should say, interviewing Swedish journalists was a really important source for this book, important part of the research process. And they were able to access some Swedish copyright documents and piece together that there was, in certain cases, actually this really small group of Swedish songwriters who were responsible for hundreds of artist monikers and thousands of tracks under those artist monikers that were getting really prime placement in all of these first-party Spotify playlists. So playlists, seemingly edited by in-house curators at Spotify. So clearly something was up. So in the reporting that I did for the book, through interviews with former employees, musicians, people who worked in the music business, and review of internal correspondence and documents, I was able to kind of pull back the veil on the story a little bit and learned that there actually was a specific team internally at Spotify that was dedicated to overseeing these more lean back mood playlists. And they had a name for this type of, what the press had been calling fake artist content. Internally, they had this secret name for it, perfect fit content.
PFC.
And internally, they were describing PFC as tracks commissioned to fit specific moods and vibes with improved margins. So, you kind of know that this was a cost-saving initiative. And then, further research, I was able to kind of uncover that there's this list of production companies that they license the music from, that those production companies then in turn have contracts with musicians who crank out the tracks for them. And I was able to speak with a handful of musicians who had worked for those production companies as well. And it was just, a super interesting investigation that, like I said, sort of took over my life for a minute there. But it was very interesting. And I guess the reason why during the course of the reporting, I ended up kind of embracing the term ghost artists is because I was reporting this at a moment when the conversation about AI and creative labor and generative AI music had really started to take hold. And I wanted to make sure I was making a distinction that for the most part in the reporting I was doing, I was finding that, these playlists actually weren't yet filled with generative AI music, TBD. But in what I found, it was actually these production companies hiring actual musicians.
In the old days, we called that library music.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so that, again, that's something that's always existed.
Mm-hmm.
But I guess part of the newness of the Spotify story is the way, the degree to which it has penetrated our culture and the way we consume. You had to go and search for library music.
Yeah.
In your telling, it's being pumped into millions of people's earbuds and homes and cars without them knowing it.
Yeah. So library music or production music also sometimes get called being this type of music that for a very long time, historically, musicians might have a day job making a lot of these tracks that go into these sometimes royalty-free libraries that people who are looking for music for an advertisement or a TV show or film might access these libraries of music. Something I write earlier in the book is that I think one way to look at the story of Spotify is it's the story of these advertising industry men, the co-founders of Spotify, Daniel Ek and Martin Lawrenson. Their backgrounds are in advertising. In some ways, it's like a story of the logic of the advertising industry being brought to music in new ways. And then another way I talk about it is that, the fact that, yes, like there's always been library music, there's always been, pop music, independent music that exists within these within their own ecosystems. I kind of think of this as a sort of like, there's this phrase media theorists use, context collapse. In some ways, it kind of feels like what we're experiencing is this sort of context collapse, like collapsing of the musical purpose all into the same platform, where you have all this music that's made for all these different reasons that people seek out for all these different reasons, sort of consolidated onto this one platform in this one economic system, and that's confusing, I think.
Yeah. I mean, as bad as it is to have this sort of generic PFC music in these playlists, and it's there because it's cheap for Spotify to put it there, to me, it's almost worse what happens to some genuine musicians who feel pressured to accept even less than the 0.0, how many zeros is it before we get to a digit?
0.0035.
0035
Yeah.
cents that they're getting in order to increase their chances of getting their music put on a playlist.
Yeah, so you mean the musicians that are making the material? Absolutely, yeah, and that's why so chapter 5 of my book, Ghost Artists for Hire, is followed by chapter 6 called The Background Music Makers, and it's all like interviews with musicians who have participated in this practice or made music for these companies. And yeah, I found it really important to also kind of like show their perspective on it as well, because a lot of the musicians I spoke with who are making music for these production companies, they're not like, I feel like there's this, with the whole like fake artist narrative that had emerged over the years, there's this sense that these were kind of like scammers or something. It's like most of these people are just like working musicians who are scraping together a living from multiple different revenue streams, who have, because the economics of making a living as a recording artist today are so bleak, have found this to be like a nice additional revenue stream to add to the many revenue streams from which they're drawing to make a living,
Yeah.
And something that was super interesting in the process of reporting this part of the book as well was that there was definitely a point in the reporting process where I knew more about the whole arrangement than like the musicians themselves, because they're left so in the dark about it. Like everything with streaming contracts is so secretive, but there's particularly been like a lot of secrecy around this practice. So the musicians I interviewed would say like, oh, well, yeah, I just make the tracks, I submit them, I get paid. I don't really know what happens after that. If anything, I'm glad for the reporting to be able to contribute to some transparency for those musicians as well.
And what about, emerging artists, independent artists who want to get placed on a playlist and, will accept a smaller slice of the pie in order to, that to me is,
So, like I mentioned, there's
really dispiriting.
two investigations in the book. If one of the investigations is into this ghost artist practice, the other one was into new forms of payola-like practices on streaming, or new forms of pay-to-play. So, payola being the word historically used when major label marketing people would go to a radio station with a pile of cash slid under the door, like exchanging it for airplay. That's what we think of when we think of payola in the streaming era. Can't prove that that's happening though. But what we do know is that there's a sort of a bigger picture of payola-like practices that have emerged. One of the ones I look into in the book is this program Spotify runs called Discovery Mode, where artists and mostly independent artists, mostly independent record labels, are asked to accept a lower royalty rate, a 30% royalty reduction in exchange for algorithmic promotion. So if you're a Spotify app listening to music through daily mix, radio, or autoplay, you are also hearing tracks that have been enrolled in this discovery mode program. And it's not labeled. And that's kind of a connection, something that connects the PFC investigation and the discovery mode investigation. And also, I think, has some sort of like, broader ramifications for dynamics playing out right now with generative AI content as well, is that, tracks that you might be recommended because they are internally labeled PFC, tracks you might be recommended as a user because they're enrolled in discovery mode are not labeled. It's not made clear to you as a listener that you're being recommended this track because of a commercial partnership or a commercial deal that's in place. There's all sorts of other ways in which this kind of material could be labeled.
Well, and perhaps, the single biggest opaque shenanigan of Spotify, and the one that you actually quote somebody saying, if you look at what they're doing, it's so easy a child could understand it. You unpack it, I still don't understand it, and that is the pro rata system by which artists get quote unquote paid.
Yeah, quote unquote paid is a good way to put it.
So it's not, if I say Spotify hauls in this pile of money every month and then they pay it out to the artists, that's not really how it works.
Yeah, that's not what's going on.
How does it work?
Yeah, so payments are not by stream, they are not directly to artists. I feel like one way to understand it is that if you're an artist and you make music and you want to have it on Spotify, you have to go through what's called a rights holder. So the major record labels all have their own deals with Spotify to have music put on the platform. They own rights to certain music. If you're not on a major label, your label might be part of, there's this organization called the Merlin Group that represents thousands of independent record labels. Or if you're a DIY musician who makes a track tonight and you want to put it on Spotify tomorrow, you could go through a DIY distribution company like DistroKid or CD Baby, and those companies all hold contracts with streaming services as well. So there's all these rights holders that have contracts with Spotify that artists go through, and those are the entities that are getting paid by Spotify. And the payments are being made not on a per stream basis, but on a pro rata basis, which means, if you are Universal Music Group and your catalog on streaming service during a royalty period accounts for 30% of total streams on the platform, then you would be entitled to 30% of the streaming royalty pot according to the terms of the contract that you have with the streaming service. And then you would get your slice of the pie along with some reports that tell you which artists got played, how many times they got played, and then you in turn have your contracts with your artists. Then you turn around, take your slice of the pie, and divide it up amongst artists according to the contracts that you hold with the artists. So there's all of these different levels of abstraction that make it really complicated and also that's like a vastly oversimplified explanation of it. There's so many factors that go into like how a stream is weighted. The major labels have per user minimums on the free tier. So regardless of how many streams happen, there's certain minimums that they're entitled to, and so many other factors, but it's super complicated.
And the way it works now is the way it has worked then, which is the people at the very top of each of those major labels are the ones getting the big pieces of the pie, and as you get further down the pyramid, it is literally those 17-cent checks again.
Yeah.
If you're lucky.
I mean, I've had some really funny emails. Like, I had someone email me saying, "Loved your book. In the past 20 years, I've received about $20 from Spotify, but if you're ever in Seattle, I'll use it to buy you dinner." Kind of thing. Like, cool, thanks. That sort of thing. No shortage of anecdotes. Probably some people in the room right now who could tell you about the cool fractions of pennies they have gotten from Spotify.
Yeah. So it's important, and you make the distinction between when you're talking about chill playlists, the vibe that Spotify wants to create with this or that playlist. The distinction between hearing and listening.
Oh, yeah.
And you refer to the late Pauline Oliveros, who was a pioneer of what she called deep listening, where listening is a truly active experience, whereas hearing is just, and it seems like Spotify wants you to hear.
Yeah.
They don't necessarily want you digging in and asking a lot, oh, what is this? And how does that relate to what came before?
Yeah, or that perhaps, they don't care whether you're hearing or listening. I feel like it seems like for streaming companies, the objective is just to have you streaming as much as possible, and to make it so that you don't want to cancel your subscription. So, asserting the value of this service in your life by ensuring that you're listening to it as much as possible, which, would seem to suggest like a lot of background listening happening on these services. And definitely it's interesting looking at like the, for example, the type of objectives that their algorithmic recommendation systems are optimizing for, talking to some former machine learning engineers and people who worked kind of on the algorithmic side of things at Spotify, and hearing them talk about how, there are goals around time spent on platform, like listening session, like extending listening session, like basically just trying to optimize for you listening as long as possible. There's certain, ideas about the value of music or types of music that are kind of like baked into those types of goals.
Well, again, that's radio lingo from way, way back in radio. We talk about average quarter hour, AQH, and time spent listening, TSL. And you want to keep the people who are listening at 10 minutes past the hour, you want to keep them to 16 minutes past the hour, because now they're into another quarter hour, and that boosts your AQH. And especially if you're a commercial radio station, this is what you're going to your sponsors with. So the higher those numbers, the more cash you're going to pull in. And time spent listening, that even in public radio, time spent listening is a measure of loyalty.
Yeah.
And the more loyal the listener, the more likely they are to be a contributor, So, I mean, again, Spotify didn't invent this.
Yeah. No, it's super interesting. I mean, like, a lot of the book is about the sort of championing of the idea of lean back listening in the streaming era. And I definitely feel like it's clear that streaming didn't invent the concept of lean back listening, that maybe the whole history of commercial radio could be understood as like a prehistory of lean back listening in some ways. But I do think it's interesting the ways in which it has been really like, championed in the context of, this being the way in which people are, not just discovering music, but kind of the monetization of it as well.
And the datafication of it.
Yeah.
I mean, billions and billions of clicks that, it's just like this enormous database that they have at their disposal.
Yeah.
How do you personally use Spotify?
Oh, I don't really personally use Spotify.
Okay.
Cool. I feel like, well, I mean, not that there aren't issues with the ways that, all tech platforms or whatever, but definitely the way some people are trapped in the Spotify world. I definitely say I'm trapped in the Bandcamp world a little bit, That's a tech company as well, but, a model that I think is more suited to the support of independent music. And there's a lot of musicians working on a lot of Bandcamp alternatives right now that seem very exciting, and it's definitely like a conversation to pay attention to as well. But the MP3 library I'm usually walking around with the button that says "Ask me about my MP3 library." If anybody wants to get their hands on one, I can probably help make that happen. But yeah, MP3 and radio. I mean, I feel like community radio, like, as well, has been something that has become a much bigger part of my life since I started writing about streaming and sort of like looking for alternatives. And I think that that's a common experience of independent music fans in the streaming era, as well as like looking to non-commercial radio as a source of music recommendation. Yeah.
I mean, music discovery is just such a wonderful thing, and yet, in your telling, when I see what Spotify is doing with its kind of discovery platforms, it's like a race to the bottom. It seems.
Yeah, I mean, one of the quotes from the research for the book that has haunted me and stuck with me the most is a former Spotify employee who I interviewed, who told me that the whole goal of their recommendation ecosystem and playlist system is to reduce the cognitive work that a user has to do when they open the app. And it stuck with me so much because reducing cognitive work is like another way of saying like to not have to think, or like to get you to think less. And thinking about the way that music is contextualized, like as a music critic, I think of criticism as just like another word for thinking. And I want people to think about music. I want the context through which music is presented to be context that makes people think about where the music came from, like who's recommending it, like, whether it be the context of a person who, like, a trusted voice recommending the music, or being contextualized within history, or that it came from an independent record label that you like. There's all sort of ways of contextualizing music that actually make you think about the music, and that's the direction I'd rather see music culture pushed in.
Look, for 4 decades, I've hosted a show where my thought has been, if I can get you thinking critically, we got you.
Yeah.
That's...
Totally.
Yeah.
And I mean, I've read you talking about the curious listener as someone who your show is targeted towards too. And it's like, you want to think about presenting music for the curious listener, not for someone who wants to reduce cognitive load or like whatever.
All right, I do want to leave some time for you folks to have questions. I think we have someone with a microphone. So if you have a question, raise your hand. We'll get a mic to you, and you can ask a question of Liz Pelly.
Hi. Good. Oh my God. Sorry. Good evening. I just wanted to say I was like a senior in college when the Big Mood Machine article came out, and I remember it changing my life. And now I'm like a full-grown adult, and I'm like, holy shit. But do you see a way that, like, out of this machine, for lack of a better word, are we just locked into this system where we're paying artists a fraction of the percent the rest of forever and hoping that Bandcamp or some other alternative gets its shit together one day? Or like, is there something else? Is there a way to kind of, for lack of a better word, abolish the system that we've all been locked into by Spotify and Tidal and Apple Music and whatever?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I mean, I feel like if I didn't think that was possible, I think it would just be too depressing to even write about. And I think that in some ways, from my perspective, like the last 2 chapters of this book, like, so chapter 18 being where I talk about the sort of new music labor movement that has emerged the past 5 years, and different musicians, unions, and solidarity organizations that have emerged to hold streaming services accountable. And then the conclusion where I talk about all different sorts of alternatives being built by musicians, and I talk about the role of like public funding for the arts and public libraries, and helping reimagine not just an alternative to streaming, but like alternative ways that we could value music in society. If I didn't think that like there were viable alternatives to look to all around the world, I don't know if I would be able to stomach writing about this subject. But I kind of describe those 2 chapters as like the book's reason for existing in some ways. So some things I talk about in the book are like different like cooperative models that artist communities have experimented with over the years, and I know that there are a handful of different artist groups working on similar projects now. Yeah, I mean, I think buying music directly from artists is like in the interim right now, like a best alternative that we have to streaming. But I also remain excited about some of these alternative platforms that are brewing as well.
You do write at one point that the solution to venture capital's intrusion into music is not more venture capital.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I think that
Well, you wrote it.
True, I did write that. I do think though that like, you know, we get to think about like the alternative to the problems of streaming as simply creating a new, more fair version of streaming is also kind of like not expanding our imaginations enough.
So it can't be imposed from the top down. It needs to
exactly. Yeah. And I think that, you know, looking at all of these alternative platforms that are starting to emerge now, I really do think it's the ones that are born of music scenes that like I am the most excited about too.
All right. Another question.
Yeah, thank you, Liz and John, for the talk. So I'll preface this by saying I haven't had a chance to read the book yet, although I did get a notification on my way over that my copy is ready for pickup at the Seward Park Library. So shout out NYPL for that.
So cool.
So that's to say, if you cover this in the book, I apologize for the redundancy, but in 2018, Spotify piloted a direct distribution beta where through the Spotify for Artists platforms, you could upload your music directly to Spotify instead of using TuneCore or CD Baby or whatever. Then after a year, they scrapped it without much of an explanation, other than they were like excited to deepen their relationships with their digital distribution partners or something to that effect. So I'm just curious, why do you think they scrapped that direct distribution, which at the time seemed like a rare altruistic move from Spotify, although most people speculated that it was just a data-driven decision.
Yeah, no, it's super interesting. There is a chapter in the book that discusses that. So in the second half of the book, which gets way more directly into the impact of the streaming model on the material realities of artists' lives, and there's a chapter 14 called An App for a Boss. I believe that's the chapter where that is discussed in. But there is a former Spotify employee who is interviewed about that moment and how there was this sort of moment where it seemed like, like Daniel Ek, it seems, has like always been sort of obsessed with this idea of the long tail, like the idea of the ability of the internet to like support thousands and thousands of small scale creators. The company says their mission is helping 1 million. I mean, it used to be 1 million musicians making a living off their art, and now it's helping 1 million creators like make work that connects with audiences or something like that. But it's a really good question. It does seem like there was this moment where the company like wasn't sure which direction it was going to go into, like if it was going to go more the direction of sort of like supporting these, I mean, what we would talk about as like DIY artists and what for some reason the industry calls long tail creators, or whether it was going to go in this other direction and instead like really double down on its alignment with like the major labels and the pre-existing recorded music business as it's existed for like, the past 100 years is how someone in the book describes it. And it seems like the latter kind of won out, like there was this moment where it maybe seemed like something was going to change. And I mean, it's hard to say exactly, but from my perspective, like it feels directly connected to just the power that the major labels continue to have over the recorded music business and over the streaming model, and the ways in which streaming services, like, kind of in some ways have to be seen as like really dedicated partners to the major labels and, have to be seen as like not kind of like competing with them necessarily, but being partnered with them. So I think in the book, I even sort of like, question something that a former employee said to me and say, like, it kind of seems like this was maybe just a result of the major label influence in some ways.
All right, I think we have time for one or two more questions.
How you doing? My question is to take a further, I guess, deep dive into the title of the book. I haven't had a chance to read it yet, but I'm excited. And my question to you, Liz, would be, was the title like a further breakdown of it? Was the title inspired by Dream Machine, a song by Mark Farina?
No, but I'd love to hear it though.
All right, I think we had a question up here. Well, the people who are watching online won't get it.
Oh, sorry. I'll go first. Hi, I'm a media scholar from Canada, and what's really striking is that a lot of the terms that we use when critiquing platforms, like datafication, algorithmic bias, et cetera, come from critical studies of visual media platforms. So I'm just curious if you came across any unique distinctions or considerations that you find necessary when researching sound-based media and platforms. Thank you.
That's a really good question. And I mean, I'm not sure if it's something that necessarily I was thinking about while writing the book, especially because I don't have an academic background. I'm a journalist, so I do like try to draw from academic sources, and I interviewed some academics and tried to engage with academic texts that have been written about music streaming as much as possible, but certainly not like completely familiar with the area of study that you're referring to. There is one point in the book where especially when talking about just media literacy more broadly, I talk about in the book, and something I've thought about a lot is how I think one of the goals of the book is to sort of, in some ways, contribute to like more of a sense of media literacy when it comes to thinking about audio culture, because I do think that in general, like, we tend to kind of, not to speak too abstractly, but I think as a society, we have like a more robust sense of media literacy when it comes to visual media, when it comes to text. Like, while writing the book, there definitely was this moment where the kind of like the Dolly moment was happening, where people on the internet were really talking critically and pushing back on the rise of generative AI images. And I remember like, some people contacting me saying, the public is so like outraged about like this sort of trend in AI images, like why doesn't anyone ever talk about all of the AI music that's flooding streaming services? And part of, I think, is just like living in kind of like an uncritical audio culture and people not really having like a lot of language for speaking critically about what we hear, or maybe like a lack of understanding or something.
All right, final question, front row here.
Okay.
Yeah, just looking to the future as a musician myself, and someone who's been actually really impressed with the ability of, say, SAG and the Screenwriters Guild and a lot of other, comparable creative professions being able to band together and kind of, fix their situation in the face of AI, and the Hollywood studios, they were able to come out with quite a good deal. Why musicians and songwriters are having such a hard time making progress in the face of, these conflicts, what it would take for us to make real change, why, I've always had the sense, you saw Meryl Streep and Adam Sandler out there picketing with commercial actors when they were fighting against the studios, and I've always thought, well, if it would take a couple huge artists, probably just a few, to really make a big difference, and why there's such a reluctance at the top, particularly in music, it seems like, to take any kind of action.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. And even, I think currently someone asked me about this recently, and I feel like, getting some sort of like big name artists involved in UMA seems like it would be like the United Musicians and Allied Workers seems like it would make a big impact. But I think one thing that's really challenging with organizing musicians, and I can't say how this compares with other fields, but music is so vast and there's so many different types of labor relations that exist in music, where there are some musicians who consider themselves workers, and then there's some musicians who consider themselves to be bosses who employ workers, and the kind of like, that the vast spectrum of different types of ways in which people think of themselves, like in relation to labor, I think in some ways kind of makes it hard for there to be that kind of like more broad solidarity. That said, another really big problem for independent musicians is that in the United States, it's illegal for independent musicians to unionize or take collective action because musicians are classified as independent contractors, independent musicians. So technically, independent contractors, independent musicians collectively organizing or trying to attempt collective bargaining is illegal, and musicians who participate in stuff like that can be, considered an illegal cartel, actually. So there's currently like this piece of legislation called the Protect Working Musicians Act that is like aiming to sort of change that classification to make it so that independent musicians who are independent contractors can organize. So I definitely feel like that's a, thing to look to.
Maybe in 4 years.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think we'll have to leave it there. To all those of you who have been watching on the stream, or those of you here in the library with us, thank you all for coming. Liz Pelly's book is Mood Machine. It is out now. I'm John Schaefer. Thank you. Good night.
Thank you so much. That was so great. Yeah, I really appreciate it.